Hello, everyone, and thanks for understanding we're starting a couple minutes late. I'm Jenny Glenn Gingery. I'm the Associate Director of Communications and Media Relations at the Endocrine Society, and welcome to the second half of our virtual news conference on emerging technology in the endocrine field. We've had to split this event into two parts since we've got speakers in far-flung time zones. It really just reflects the international nature of the Endocrine Society. So today we're pleased to have with us Professor Christopher White of Prince of Wales Hospital in Randwick, Australia. And over the next few minutes, we're going to be hearing about Professor White's work applying artificial intelligence to osteoporosis care. We'll have one Q&A session at the end of our time today. Everyone should be muted, hopefully, except for the presenters. We're just asking that to avoid any distracting noises. We appreciate your help. If you could go ahead and type any questions you have into the chat window. Once the speakers finish the presentation, we'll go ahead and take any questions at the end. Please note this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to visit our YouTube channel or our online newsroom to view it after the fact. And I'll be reading the questions aloud for the benefit of anyone who may be watching at the end. So now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Professor White.
Hi, everybody. Have we got the slides there, Jenny? Fantastic. Okay, so this is, I don't know if any of you can remember a time before COVID. That was only 12 weeks ago. But our passion is osteoporosis, which is a disease that can kill and cripple people. And what we did a couple of years ago was create a virtual institute between a whole ton of universities, medical research institutes, and hospitals that are dispersed across Sydney, as well as with industry, and that's called Sphere. And I'm in the musculoskeletal group within that virtual institute setup, and we research into osteoporosis as our primary as one of our primary areas of research interest. And osteoporosis is a disease that kills and cripples people. Next slide, Jenny. Yeah, and so look, it's we take our bones for granted because we just assume they're always going to be there, but there comes a time when they fail spontaneously or just after minor injury. So at a time when you just didn't expect the bones to fail, or the injury was trivial, like you just tripped or you just fell over or or it just gives way spontaneously, that is osteoporosis. And because the skeleton is hidden from view, so to speak, we often don't pay a lot of attention to it until it fails on us. Now, the strongest predictors for a fracture is obviously getting older, and we age on the inside as we do on the outside. A test of bone mineral density and the prior fracture. And we've been working for the last 30 years establishing effective treatments, and there's been an absolute explosion in the options available to treat women, predominantly postmenopausal women, and men with this disease, so that if not curing the disease, we have really effective treatments that can reduce the risk of fracture by 50%. And yet 80% of osteoporotic patients leave hospital untreated after fracture. And the reason for that is if you come in with a myocardial infarction, the person treating your heart attack is the same person who's usually responsible for preventing the next one, right? But if you present to the emergency room with a fracture, the immediate, and particularly within that context of a busy ED burdened with COVID at the moment, you could imagine that their primary interest is to fix that fracture and get on to the next case. It's not to fix that fracture and prevent the next one. So the system is as broken as the bones that they're trying to fix, because I'm the guy who prevents the next fracture, but I'm not treating the first one. So you see the disconnect? And so what I had to do was to use artificial intelligence to get me in front of the patients that weren't being referred to me that I knew existed, because it's the sequence of the first fracture that predicts the highest likelihood of the next fracture. The correlation with cardiovascular is quite strong, in that one of the biggest predictors for a myocardial infarct is a previous myocardial infarct. And one of the best predictors for a fracture, the hip fracture, or the ones that really matter, is often having had a minor fracture in the decade beforehand. And so our opportunity for intervention is lost when people present with their hip fracture, having had a fracture 10 years earlier that we didn't respond to. So there are, social issues, medico-legal issues. It's a nightmare. So now look, the total cost to us, and this is totally preventable now, the total cost to us in Australia, now we're a country of 25 million people, so let's extrapolate back of envelope stuff to the US. You've got what, 300 million people. It costs us about $4 billion to repair these fractures each year. And my back of envelope calculations, given the fact that the Aussie dollar is crashing, might be about $24 billion to the US, but I'll stand corrected. Oh, there it is, 95 billion. Oh, well, I underestimated it. So look, osteoporosis. So what they did to fix this was to create a service, and it's a recommendation from the American Society of Bone Mineral Research, to set up fracture liaison services, osteoporosis refracture prevention services, to go in there and find the cases that need to be identified and manage them and assess them for osteoporosis and treat them. The problem is that actually requires a nurse trawling through their case records to find the patients with the fractures, to then invite them back. And if necessity is the mother of invention, I think frustration is the father, because I got so annoyed trying to recruit to osteoporosis trials and not getting the patients referred to me, despite then finding that they're actually in the hospital, that I thought, look, I'm just going to start an artificial intelligence program that will look at the radiology report and read the radiology report, and I'll bypass the referrer because I'll just get the information off the radiology report. And that's what natural language processing involved, and we developed this tool called X-ray. So next slide. So look, let me just give you a few backgrounds into artificial intelligence and natural language processing, of which 3 years ago I had very little insight, and for which, I'm dependent on experts to guide me. But the way this system works is that the study of language requires assessing the radiology report into attributes, like say a fracture, and then recognizing patterns around that attribute. So for instance, if it says no fracture or fracture not identified, you need to be able to find those pattern recognition and create that as an attribute. And then there'll be other things like loss of height. If you actually go looking for height or loss, they're not going to identify those as relevant words, but once you start putting loss of height together, it starts to create a pattern. Does that make sense? Now, when you want to use artificial intelligence in any of these contexts, they're either unsupervised, supervised, or an expert system. Now, a supervised system is you just read the radiology report, put it into the machine, into the system, and just say, look, there's a fracture in there somewhere, and in an agnostic way, you let the artificial intelligence just find what it is that says that that was a fracture, and you don't guide it in any way other than to say there was a fracture or there isn't a fracture in that report. The one that we use is more an expert system, which is iterative, and the reason I picked an expert system is that if you're reading the report to say whether there's a fracture in there or not, you might as well teach the machine as you go. And this one is actually really quite intelligent, more intelligent than some of the people I work with, because what happens is I started the process by just saying, find every report that has fracture in it, and it'll come back to me and say, well, I found all of these, like in microseconds, it'll say, I've found all of these with fracture, but what about these that have no fracture? And then I'll say, oh no, don't include the ones with no fracture, just include the ones with fracture. And then it'll come back with another set of conditions to say, but then what about these ones? And so in an iterative way, you start to create a knowledge base, which is, and it will learn and interact with you to say, well, if you make that as a decision point, then, so it's like a decision tree. And that's what the X-ray report artificial intelligence tool is. So we then set about to see if it actually worked, and that required a 3-step process, which was analytical and technical validation that it actually does what it's supposed to do. Then a clinical validation, because there's a possibility that the radiologist didn't even report the fracture, or X-ray isn't picking up the fracture. and then an external validation because these AI systems work very, very well in the systems in which they're designed, but aren't always transferable. And for instance, I'm speaking in a certain English dialect that, hopefully you can understand, but there are regional differences in language which a system will not always recognize. So I wanted to, and certainly this wouldn't apply if it was in German or in Mandarin. So what I needed to do was to check in an external subset that with no adjustment for regional differences and dialectic differences, whether it could still pick up the presence or absence of fractures to the same degree. You got the next slide there, Jenny? So what the analytical validation was really quite simple. You just pull out 5,000 reports that have been from the emergency department, and we went through about half of them that said there was no fracture, and found that there were 4 that had a false negative. And in the 433 where they said there was a fracture, 421 of them were true, 12 were false positives. And so that gave me a very high analytical sensitivity and specificity. So next. Yeah, of about 99, and I'm just going to reduce the size of you guys because there we go. Yeah, of about 99 and 99%. So the next step was the clinical validation. Okay, and so what we've got here is what actually happens in my fracture liaison service is that if I sit in model 1 is me sitting there waiting for the ED physician to refer to me. And in a 3-month period, we only got 70 referrals, okay? And even then they got it wrong 5 times. So those are the 70 that were referred to me. A junior colleague of mine went into the ED through that 3-month period and trawled through the medical record and found 224 cases that could have been coded as being related to fracture or related to osteoporosis. 98 of those. So there was a whole lot of work required to find 33 extra cases. I then turned on the artificial intelligence tool. So we were all blinded to, like the AI wasn't running at the time that we're doing the fracture light, the clinical validation. So in microseconds, we turned on the X-rate, and it trawled through the ED admissions in that 3-month period and found the 5,089, of which 433 reports of fracture were associated with 349 patients. That's, some patients had more than one radiology image. So that equated to 339 fractures. So at the end of this, I had you've got to be careful what you wish for because suddenly I went from 70 referrals to 339, and given that there were 98 in the data set that could be found by trawling, that was a 3.5-fold higher increase in the number of fractures that I detected. So next, Jenny. Okay, so when we broke down, I was expecting to see the entire 98 patients picked up by X-ray. So I was surprised when we found that there were only 57. Now, 17 of those reports had been generated after the patient had been admitted into the hospital, and so it was now an inpatient. And I'd restricted the data set to just the ED model. So 17 didn't get into X-ray, but the 57 were interesting because there should have been 81. So next slide. If we break down those 224 patients that were part of the clinical validation, I'll concentrate down there on the 24. There were 24 that had a known fracture that we knew had a fracture in the ED, and X-ray hadn't picked them up. When we broke it down, it was about 50-50. X-ray either hadn't actually picked up the report as having fracture, or the patient, the radiologist hadn't actually reported the fracture event or the loss of vertebral height, which is usually what they miss. Next slide. So that gave me a clinical sensitivity of 70%. So while the analytical sensitivity and specificity is very high, the clinical sensitivity is about 70%. So then I went and now this was all in one site at the Prince of Wales. So I stepped out to, next slide, the Dubbo Osteoporosis Epidemiology Study, which is then the advantage of having a virtual institute because you can start working with people in other institutions. And what they've got is a prospective study that's been going for 30 years, the Dubbo Osteoporosis Epidemiology Study, where they have actually acquired all of the radiology reports from the Dubbo area, which is an isolated city in the centre of New South Wales, or a city in Australia. And what they do is characterise and confirm and adjudicate the presence or absence of fracture. And then we were able to get 327 of those reports. We ran them through X-rate, and for those that were positive in X-rate, there were 87 of them that had a true fracture, and for those that were X-rate negative, we found that 38 of them were a false negative. In other words, there were fractures sitting inside that X-rate said did not exist. So that gave me a next, Jenny. Again, that sensitivity looks like it's about 70%. The specificity is very high. And so the conclusions of all of this work were, next slide, that natural language processing can screen very high volumes of radiology reports to identify more patients at risk with very high analytical and clinical specificity. You have to be careful what you wish for, because the numbers have overwhelmed my osteoporosis refracture prevention service. And so I now got to adjust to that. And further development will be to link the artificial intelligence with the clinical risk factors and treatment data to assist my fracture coordinators to target the right patient. What we'll do is we'll increase the number of patients with osteoporosis on treatment, we'll improve productivity and safety, and reduce the burden of care. So we basically want to save money safely. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor White. So we'll now be taking questions in the chat window. If you want to go ahead and type your questions in there, and please make sure you've identified your institution and your full name if it's not on your login.
Can I chat?
Sure, if you have something you want to expand on.
So where I think this has got some, where this is going to go, Jim clinged to everyone, are there concerns over patient privacy? Patients might want to be identified. Well, that's an interesting point, because they've actually come to the ED to get their fracture attended to. So it's almost a reverse question. We have a duty of care to identify, because now that we've actually got a known treatment to prevent the next fracture, we are actually medico-legally liable if we don't actually identify. The other thing about this, where one of the directions that this will go, is that this is really a quality and safety product. Because while I started from osteoporosis, where this morphs is that there are consultants who identify coincidental lesions on radiology films and then put them into the report, but they're not actually either read or followed up or understood. Or do you see the problem? And so the safety issue, or the safety benefit that runs from this, is we're developing the capacity for the radiologists to identify to our patient safety people that they've identified something that was unexpected, and they now have an obligation to report to the patient safety. So that alone, our medico-legal bills are significant from misdiagnoses, and so that alone funds the research program.
So Professor White, I think we were speaking a little bit about when we spoke about this before. So essentially the problem used to be that 70 to 80% of the people were just missed by the process. And even with false negatives and false positives, the natural language processing can identify in the neighborhood of 70% of the patients you're looking for.
Definitely. So they were always there. It was just that the process of managing osteoporosis is fractured, because the person that you see to manage the fracture is not the person you're charged with the responsibility of fixing it. So I stopped the second fracture. You know, I have trouble tying up my shoelaces, so you definitely don't want me trying to fix the first one. So this is about trying to create that connection using the information is in the system. We're actually liable for that. We actually have a responsibility, duty of care. There was a time when there was nothing you could do. That is no longer the case. So we need to identify those 80% that are leaving without being identified, or without being, or they have actually been identified without actually getting a response to close that loop. So those are the wicked problems we face. Look, where I think this will go is that AI is so powerful that why am I dealing with you know, a radiologist's interpretation of a film? You're going to get AI just reading the film because I'm dependent on the on the radiologist actually reporting the fracture for this NLP to then find it. So that you know, I think a career in radiology could be challenging. There's another question here. Are there concerns? Yes. Patients might not want to be identified. If you're getting an influx of referrals, have you come up with ways to identify which patients should get priority? That's exactly where this is going, because so on that last slide, I indicated that the next phase of the research is to start linking the EMR and the data that's contained within the EMR with their fracture report, because the Garvan Institute and the WHO have generated risk calculators. And so then it is a fairly straightforward process of calculating the risk of each patient, then prioritising those at the highest risk. And in particular, if they're already on medication for osteoporosis, they're not the ones that I need to, because you can still fracture while you're on therapy, because a 50% reduction in risk is not a cure. So patients could be on treatment, and therefore it would be unethical and inappropriate for me to be intervening in somebody who's under somebody else's care to offer treatment that they're already on.
Great. Let's see. I don't see any other questions, so I think we can go ahead and wrap up. And I hope everyone who's on, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Professor White. And then tomorrow, please keep in mind we are having additional news conferences on obesity and thyroid health, and we hope you can join us for those. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thank you for your time. Cheers now. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you. We appreciate it.